Thank you for joining us for the next edition of the CyberSide chats, this one on emerging cybersecurity issues. This CyberSide chat will really be a launching point for a series of CyberSide chats regarding cybersecurity, where we'll delve into the issues we discussed today in a lot greater detail. Our agenda today really focuses on the top-level concerns in cyber, what the targets are, who are the attackers, and why are they attacking, as well as an overview of steps your company can take pre-breach and post-breach to try to help mitigate some of these issues. In terms of the top-level issues, the first issue that companies should consider is really, are they a controller or a processor when they're looking at cyber? And they may be both. And what I mean by that is you may be the data owner or the controller. In certain cases, if you're particularly in a business-to-business setting, you might be a processor or service provider, or as we'd say under HIPAA, a business associate. And how you look at cyber certainly that's an important consideration, but how you look at issues such as notice and indemnities and a variety of other things certainly is affected by whether you're a controller or a processor or both, depending on the data set you're dealing with. The next really set of issues, just to tee up, is one of the main issues is how do we distinguish data misuse from third-party attacks? And one way to sort of say that is we may be looking at a difference in some ways between privacy and security. Data misuse typically is a first-party issue, I'd say, which is you have a failure to disclose your practices, you have a failure to comply with applicable laws, there may be marketing violations, but it's the company that rightfully has the data making alleged mistakes about the data. That's different than cybersecurity, where we really look at third-party focused attacks. So these are parties that shouldn't have access to the data that get it. And we see obviously theft of information being one, and we'll talk about the targets from an information standpoint, as well as attacks on the grid. And that we see as either distributed denial of service or DDoS attack, attempts to shut down systems, maybe attempts to actually delete data, a variety of other things. And so when you're looking at the types of attacks you could be dealing with, obviously there's an information-focused attack as well as an attack on the grid. And when we look at the targeting by attackers of sort of what information they're looking for and what they're trying to do, companies have a significant amount of information, both PII or person identifiable information, as well as information about the company. And here we see the variety of different information sources that do include PII, but also include a variety of other things. And so when you look at this, obviously financial information can have value to attackers. Information regarding individuals, as we all know, can have value to attackers. But then you see obviously IP, proprietary and confidential information, whether that's undisclosed M&A activity, business plans and marketing plans, pricing, as well as some of the other examples you see here. Information regarding business processes can have value to a competitor, and that can be a target of cyber attack. As we move into the world of IoT, some of the user-generated information, machine data, may have significant value to competitors or to state actors. And so all of these types of information have to be focused on and considered when you're looking at your cybersecurity plans, because simply looking at PII may not be sufficient for many companies. The other, obviously, thing we noted before is attacks on the grid. That can be shutting down electronic systems that create business issues. It can be any number of different things. It can actually be shutting down a utility or an electrical grid, but it can be broader than that. And so when you're looking at the targeting and what may be done to your company, you've got to consider all of these issues and perhaps others, and just to determine what would an attacker want to do to your company, how could they generate value, or how could they damage your company, as you're looking at really how you try to deal with some of these cybersecurity issues. Another important consideration is who the threat actors are and what are their goals. And there's obviously a variety of different threat actors that can be in play, but generally speaking, I think you see those four categories I've listed here, which is organized criminals, nation states, hacktivists, and insiders. And I think hacktivists are one that gets some attention, but there are groups out there that can target companies and others for reasons really unrelated to economic gain or nation state kind of activity. And so it's just an important thing to consider as you're considering the who. You have to factor all of these actors and perhaps others in, and insiders obviously are an important one to consider in addition to the other three. The goals really, again, there's a variety of different goals, and it depends on the nature of the attacker as well as the nature of your company. But generally speaking, the goals of these threat actors is to obtain information such as intellectual property, obtain financial information. Obviously, that can include information that has financial value, such as PII. There's strategic access and destruction. Terrorism can be a goal as well, whether that's cyber as a threat vector or a cyber attack that causes it directly, and also, particularly in the case of hacktivists, embarrassment. And so there can be economic motivations, there can be nation-state motivations, there can also be just pure raw embarrassment. And one thing to note there, obviously, executives' emails and other individuals' emails can be a target there as well. And so that's just another piece of information you have to consider as you're looking at cyber. Cyber's been an issue that has gotten obviously much more press recently, and people are focused on cyber attacks directly, but there's really, I'd say, three issues that are important to consider as emerging issues. One is cyber as a threat vector, and what I mean by that is cybersecurity and a cyber breach can lead to direct cyber consequences, but cyber itself can be a threat vector to cause either a kinetic or physical manifestation, obtain information that allows someone to do something in the real world rather than the cyber world, if you will. And so people need to start considering cyber not just as a threat itself, but as a enabler or a threat vector that can be used as a two-stage attack to cause further damage, whether it's physical or other forms. And so as you're considering cyber, it is probably something everyone should think about is it a direct threat? Is there a cyber direct threat against your company? But also, could we be a staging point for an attack on another company? Could we be attacked using cyber to have a kinetic or physical manifestation of that as well? One thing we continue to see is the use of business email and the compromise of business email to obtain strategic access to systems, whether that's phishing, or other forms of attack, or getting money wired out of a company, or getting W-2s to steal PII regarding employees or others. And so business email compromise continues to be a threat that companies need to consider. There's other threats as well, but in many cases, business email compromise is the easiest path for an attacker, and that's the one they'll choose. I think the other issue that has either emerged or is emerging almost completely is what we're seeing is an increased surface area of attack. So as we all use more connected devices, obviously there's more attack points or surface area for attackers. And so I think one of the things that we all need to consider is how are we going to balance the need for and desire for technology with the fact that we're increasing the surface area in our homes and probably in our companies as well as we move into an IoT world. It's just the more connected devices there are, the more chance there is for some attacker to try to use those against us. And so companies have done, I think, a good job of trying to balance that risk, but it's something that we as users of the technologies need to understand and try to address as we move forward into a much more connected world. So we've talked about the threats, what they are, who they really are coming from, and how the threats are changing. Let's talk a little bit about how a company can try to prepare. And here we see there's a number of different pre-breach considerations that the company should really consider. That includes identifying critical systems, looking at what key legal and notice requirements there are, having some form of an incident response plan, as well as in really identifying the key internal and external stakeholders, so that's done pre-breach. You want to avoid a situation where you're trying to scramble and identify who the key players are in your company for cyber while a breach is ongoing. Obviously, trying to figure out who you would want to be in touch with as we'll talk about in a moment on the next slide, but who you want to be in contact with, whether that's law enforcement, key regulators, or others, is obviously something that you can certainly do before an incident, and I think it's something that can really redound to your benefit to try to do it pre-incident. Obviously, identifying professionals, whether that's legal, PR help, incident response, or forensics, as well as really credit monitoring providers as well is a critical thing. One thing we've seen a lot of companies do recently is conduct a tabletop exercise. Obviously, practicing these kind of things is an important thing to do and can help really make your response much more efficient and help you figure out issues before an incident occurs. Looking at anomaly detection really is I think something many companies are starting to consider, which is how are they detecting these incidents and looking for anomalous behavior that just doesn't look like other behavior on their information systems. And so that's one way companies are trying to get a little bit ahead of the curve and see these incidents before they blossom into a complete full-blown cyber breach. Having relationships with law enforcement as well as others in your industry to try to understand what you're seeing and how you may be able to cut off an attack before it really gets to a bad place is also important. We're seeing a lot of companies as well look at what the role of management versus the board is, and that's something we'll talk about for sure in a future discussion. But management has a certain role, board has an oversight role, and balancing those two and making sure they mesh together is important pre-incident if it can be done. Obviously, conducting the appropriate security reviews, whether that's pen testing or a variety of other things, is important as well, and companies should consider how that fits into their broader information security planning and structure. Another consideration is what the actual standards for cyber security are, and for some companies that are heavily regulated, those are detailed. But for many companies, they're not, and companies need to determine what is a reasonable security program given the risks they face and other factors. And so, for non-heavily regulated companies, there are still standards or other things that can be looked at. In some cases, companies may have contractual requirements regarding security that they need to meet. There may be third-party standards that may not be binding, but people in the industry look to, and companies need to determine whether those are important or not and how those should be implemented, if at all. There obviously can be legal requirements. There's a number of states that have data security laws, some of which provide some detail and some of which, frankly, really look towards reasonableness as a touchstone. And there can be other best practice considerations that certainly aren't binding on your company, but are important to consider, particularly in hindsight, if there is a data security incident. And looking at those can help really a company address concerns about what their cybersecurity program was and why it was reasonable in hindsight, even though there was a data security incident. One thing that's gotten a lot of attention, obviously, recently is what are the consequences of a breach, and there's a variety of them. Obviously, there's impact on brand and trust. There's bad PR that flows from these incidents. Corporate governance issues can happen, and management and or the board can be criticized for not doing enough in certain cases to manage cyber risk. There's obviously significant costs and use of internal resources, and from a board and management perspective, I think one of the things here is how do you balance the earnings impact of an event versus the earnings impact of how you're going to prepare and what you need to spend to prepare. And that's again an issue we'll deal with down the road, but it's important to flag that it's not as simple as simply throwing a lot of money at cyber and thinking you can have it under control even if you had an unlimited budget. Cyber is not one of those areas where you can simply just fix it by throwing a lot of money at it. And most companies have to try to balance what their risk tolerance is, what's appropriate for a company of their size and maturity and the industry they're in, and try to come up with a plan that's reasonable, that has the best impact on earnings all the way around. Obviously, enforcement by regulators on a global basis can happen, and in the U.S., private litigation certainly occurs, and that may be something that we see more and more around the globe as new laws come online, particularly in Europe. And finally, we'll look at now what do you do, what should you do when a breach occurs. The first thing that has to be done is to contain and recover. You have to stop the breach as soon as you can, and that's got to be the first priority. Determining what your information sharing strategy will be, including whether you're going to reach out to people in your industry to see if they're getting hit with the same kind of malware or cyber attack, is something that needs to be considered, certainly, and is an important factor as you're looking at a breach. Document preservation, including forensic collection, may be appropriate, and whether you're going to invoke attorney-client or work product is an important consideration, particularly if you're bringing in a forensic consultant. And so not every breach certainly means necessarily that litigation hold has to be done every single time, but it's something that companies should at least probably in certain cases consider and determine what the appropriate strategy is and what's needed given the facts of this and the circumstances. Getting your arms around the facts or making the facts stand still is critical. You've got to be able to understand what happened and be able to explain it, usually to either the people who were the target of the attack, who, in essence, whose information was taken, to regulators. Maybe it's to people within your own organization, but having one source of truth, if you will, on what the facts are is something that is important for companies as they try to manage the risks around cyber after an incident happens. That feeds into having a PR plan that makes sense, that's based on sort of what you know, and trying to figure out what the appropriate strategy is on going public on this quickly or waiting until the facts develop more. That also is important in considering really notice and disclosure and other legal obligations, and tying that to the PR plan is really a critical thing as well. And companies at times can struggle with those issues, and it's a difficult balance, but that's one of the harder balances to really hit, if you will. And finally, determining what your engagement strategy is with law enforcement. Having those relationships before an incident happens is really important, but also, frankly, determining when you're going to engage with law enforcement in an incident is important. There's times where you will want to, there's times where it may not make sense, but considering that is an important thing, and having those relationships ahead of time is pretty important as well. Also looking at, once the incident is a bit more in the rearview mirror, looking at a lessons learned sort of perspective from an incident is important. It helps the company learn, even if it's not a massive breach. Trying to learn from these issues is important, and so you can do it better the next time. And those are really, I think, at a top level what companies need to be looking at when a breach has occurred. We'll get into a variety of these issues on cyber in future CyberSide chats, and thank you for your time.